I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Hillary Haden. I'm the organizing director at the Trade Justice Education Fund. I want to thank our speaker, Brook Baker from Health Gap, who we're going to hear from in just a minute, for being here tonight. He's incredibly knowledgeable on the proposal, and we're really grateful that we were able to lock him in to give us the 411 on what's in it. So both the Trade Justice Education Fund and Health Gap have been at the forefront of the fight for the TRIPS waiver for the last year and a half, alongside many of you. And we're holding this briefing today because last week, Politico EU broke the story that the EU, the US, South Africa, and India had reached an agreement at the WTO on a waiver of IP rights that does not include tests or treatments and is severely limited even on the question of vaccines. After more than a year of stalling at the WTO, this is really not the proposal that we have all been working toward. And the proposal effectively abandons the billions of people that still don't have access to COVID vaccines and treatments. The greed of wealthy nations that continue to block the real waiver is costing countless lives and putting the world at risk of new variants that threaten to undo all the progress we've made against the virus everywhere. As Brook speaks, I suspect that folks will have questions on what's in the proposal. If you have a question, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A feature or in the chat to the hosts. After Brook goes over the proposal, I will go ahead and give him some of your questions to field. So with that, Brook, I want to thank you so much for being with us on short notice. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Just to let you know, this is really the third briefing of the day, which shows what an incredibly important issue this is. Earlier today, Sangeeta from Third World Network and myself gave a presentation to WTO delegates in Geneva, or who were Zooming in, certainly not all of them, but some of the interested ones, with critical perspectives on the waiver in the hopes of the proposed text, rather. Hoping to convince some of them that it's not worth supporting and that it should be rejected in its current form and that countries should go back to the drawing board. Then we had something that approached a 3-hour Zoom with colleagues in South Africa, also on the waiver proposed text and the steps that might be taken in South Africa to stiffen the resolve of negotiators there to resist this text and to assess it, on its merits and to find it wanting and to basically re-rally the world for a meaningful waiver. And then, thankfully, this as well. Later in the day for me, end of the work, end of the work day or study day for many of you. So what I want to do is try to present the highlights of what this text does and doesn't do, and then some, in kind of 3 different kinds of categories, but certainly leave room along the way for questions and responses and thoughts by others, particularly about what might be done with respect to the US position, which is part of the background problem. I think it makes sense to describe the background first, at least in very quick summary form, because so many of you have been working on the TRIPS waiver for such a long period of time. And you know that nearly 18 months ago, in early October of 2020, after the voluntary mechanisms that had been set up to try to get big pharma companies to voluntarily input their intellectual property into something called the WHO COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. Not a single company had done so. The companies had actually instead indicated that they were not inclined to do so and that intellectual property was not really a problem and that they had everything under control. They were right, they did have everything under control, their exclusive monopoly control. And so, the proponents, which were South Africa and India, thought that it was time to put pressure to actually try to forcibly remove the intellectual property barriers that would prevent scaled up manufacture, more affordable pricing, and more equitable distribution of vaccines, and then eventually what we hoped would be new therapeutics, new medicines, and certainly access to tests as well. And so a very comprehensive waiver proposal was made to the WTO. It initially had a significant number of developing country supporters. That number has increased to 65 formal supporters at this point, but probably twice that number who actively support the waiver in some form or another. We may all remember, but way back when we had a different president, and that president did not support the waiver, and in fact, actively opposed it. And people look forward to what the change might be when the Biden administration came on board. At the same time that former President Trump was stating his opposition, we heard a round of opposition from leaders in the European Union and the United Kingdom and Switzerland and Norway and Australia, a bunch of, basically rich countries that themselves had run to the front of the line to snap up early supplies of vaccines. And they were thinking that IP was working pretty well for them because the vaccines had been researched and developed and gone through clinical trials, largely with support of federal funding and government funding in from other countries. And we were surprised and happy about how quickly the vaccines came on board, and rich people in rich countries had quick access, and everything was looking pretty good from Berlin and Washington. But of course, for the rest of the world, it didn't look good. The supplies that were supposed to go to the COVAX facility to supply low and middle income countries, the supplies that countries might have tried to get themselves bilaterally, had basically been purchased through advanced purchase agreements by rich countries. And so, and the companies were refusing to share their technology. They were simultaneously saying, well, intellectual property is not a problem, and we're going to keep it. In some sense, one or the other had to be true, right? Either it was a problem and had to be overcome, or they needed to keep it because IP was a protection for them that they finally wanted. So, fast forward just a bit. Finally, because of pressure on the new president from folks like yourselves and many others, the President Biden was forced to announce that the United States would support an intellectual property waiver on vaccines. And regrettably, that was a regressive decision even then, because even at that point in time, there were medicines in the pipeline that were being used in the U.S., not just the pipeline, there were monoclonal antibodies being used in the US and some other inpatient medicines. And there was a pipeline of promising outpatient therapies as well. And at the same time, a little bit shortly thereafter, the European Union came forward with a really fundamentally stupid set of proposals about compulsory licensing. Now, I teach international intellectual property. I don't know how much people know about compulsory licensing, but it's basically a mechanism that the governments have to allow generic competition, to bypass a patent upon certain conditions and sometimes certain payments, to allow another producer to come on board. But from the very beginning, it's been obvious that overcoming patents alone would not be enough. There needed to be access to trade secrets, to the background confidential information, data, technical manufacturing know-how of very complex manufacturing processes, formula, safety protocols, basically a whole bunch of information that is needed to have commercial scale production of medicines of assured quality. And shortly after the South Africa and India announced this bold proposal for waiver at the WTO, Moderna went so far as to say, well, we're not going to enforce our patents on our vaccine, but we're not going to share the technology. And the offer of patents alone was insufficient to actually give freedom to operate of any company in the world to actually be able to produce the Moderna vaccine. No company had the underlying know-how, the recipe, and that kitchen and the ingredients to actually make the COVID messenger RNA vaccine that Moderna had. Okay, so there's been a long, drawn out, arduous, painful negotiation at the WTO. which in more recent months is really narrowed down to negotiations between the European Union, the US, South Africa, and India. And throughout that process, the US has played the role of saying it supported a waiver on vaccines, but that it could not force a deal. All it could do was help broker a deal. And the European Union played the bad cop in this situation and basically insisted on the compulsory licensing solution and no settlement of the trade secret issue. And the U.S. continued to insist, well, maybe we'll get to therapeutics and testing later, but for now we want to focus on vaccines because that's a matter of urgency and variants are coming back to haunt us in the U.S. So it's within that backdrop that there was a leaked text. We'd heard glimmers about what was going on and certainly tried to apply pressure, and many of you have been active in campaigns here in the US to try to get the US to play a more proactive role, to get off the fence, to stop treading water, to actually support the waiver on tests and treatment, and to paint the European Union and especially Germany into the corner. And unfortunately, those efforts were not successful to actually get the US to play the role it could have and should have played. And the Europe did persist in its role, which is why we have a text now, which is, for all intents and purposes, focused on compulsory licensing only, with one real exception. So I'm going to start with the major critiques of what the draft text proposes, and then I'll talk about some of the extra burdens that the proposal puts on countries that are what are called TRIPS plus. They're requirements that are not otherwise required by the TRIPS agreement, the WTO TRIPS agreement, or that reduce the flexibilities the countries have under existing provisions of the TRIPS agreement. And then kind of conclude with why this is such a bad deal and what we might do to take this further and get a better outcome. So I've already alluded to the fact that this is proposed as a vaccine-only solution at this time. And that's bad in and of itself, because we know that in the United States, people have access to testing for a long time. It's one of the ways people find out their status and get connected to care, and now can get some outpatient treatments, including Merck's molnupiravir and Pfizer's Paxlovid, which if taken early can significantly reduce the risk of hospitalization and death, and which President Biden proudly described in his State of the Union and talked about establishing a test to treat program in the US and bragging about having secured 20 million courses of treatment of Paxlovid alone. And yet the US has said to the rest of the world, to developing countries, well, you can wait 6 months. The text of this agreement is vaccines only. It says they will turn to the issue of whether it should apply or as is or modified to treatments and testing within the next 6 months. Well, I'd like to know what people who get sick are supposed to do in the next 6 months without adequate tests and without adequate treatments. I guess they're going to do what they've been doing all along, which is getting sicker and in some instances dying inside or outside the hospital. At the same time that rich people in rich countries enjoy the benefit of the therapies that have been invented through concerted and collaborative scientific effort. So that one big default is delay and no guarantee actually of coverage of treatments and therapies. Well, even as a vaccine only outcome, the question would be, does it really give expanded access to vaccines? What it basically says is, well, we're going to address, clarify, and maybe fix a few issues with respect to compulsory licenses, but we're not going to touch trade secrets. Without touching trade secrets, no company is going to be capacitated to actually manufacture these vaccines. They simply can't do it unless they reverse engineer the entire process of commercial scale manufacturing. knowing what the equipment is, knowing, what the formulas are, getting the reagents, setting things up, having the protocols, having the safety and quality assurance checks, having access to, a lot of confidential information. All of this will have to be done by scratch. And there's actually a company in WHO messenger RNA technology transfer hub in South Africa, which is now regrettably having to do that. They've made some microliters of the Moderna vaccine, but now because they haven't gotten the technology transfer, they're going to have to go through months and what may end up being years of further technological development to manufacture at a commercial scale. So this is a very cynical and misleading agreement. And it's highly misleading that major newspapers have reported it as a breakthrough for vaccines. It's not a breakthrough for vaccines. No vaccine manufacturer, I repeat, no vaccine manufacturer will have the technology transfer that it needs to be able to quickly come to scale and manufacture commercial quantities of any of the vaccines because of this agreement. Okay, so those are two really, really bad things. What are some other really, really bad things? Well, another bad thing is, there are a bunch of countries which are excluded from reliance on this new system. The new text proposes that the only countries eligible to either manufacture and export or to import and use are so-called developing countries, which is a self-designation at the WTO. Now, that's admittedly a lot of low and middle income countries, but it's not all of them. Some of them have taken on the status of developed countries. And in addition, that definition does not, on its face anyway, cover least developed countries, though in all probability, the negotiators intended that. But it pays no attention to non-WTO members who are equally, usually some of the poorest countries in the world, and equally in need of vaccine and access to tests and treatment. And they're not eligible. In the same way, China, because it produces more than 10% of the vaccines exported globally last year, is also not eligible. The eligibility issue means that the countries where companies can be situated to manufacture and supply developing countries is limited to developing countries themselves. Developed country manufacturers and China simply cannot manufacture and export, which is a problem because most of the capability in the world on vaccines is in the global north. There's a lot in the global south too, but there's still significantly underutilized capacity in the global north, and it can't help at this point in time under this agreement. But similarly, even producers in the global south who are capable and will eventually be able to come to market, they won't be able to sell to a large number of richer countries to have an expanded market and to reach economies of scale and to incentivize more generic entry. So it's really a protectionist measure that limits both production and export and importation and use to a subset of developing countries. So those are some really major league bad things in this agreement. But then I want to talk about the actual text with respect to compulsory licensing and what it does propose. In simplest term, what it proposes to do is issue some clarifications and a very small number of waivers. Now, the clarifications are, really, in almost all instances, not only unnecessary because these flexibilities already exist and are well known and have previously been used by other countries, but because and sometimes the narrow scope of the clarification might threaten harm to countries' future ability to argue that the TRIPS agreement allows flexibilities beyond those described in this text. So, you can think of it as a Trojan horse clarification. It seems to say, okay, well, that's good that we can do that. But if it comes back later and someone says, well, that's the only thing you can do, if you haven't assessed how the limited clarification might undermine your interest in the longer term, you might underappreciate how how unhelpful some of these clarifications are. So again, it's limited to vaccines, it's limited to eligible countries, and it's limited to the duration of the COVID pandemic. There's no definition of what, when the COVID pandemic would end, for example, in the agreement. There's no actually international agreement at this time or understanding about how and when the pandemic would end. That's not technically even the terms that are used at the WTO. A second paragraph purports to give countries more discretion about how to issue an authorization to a generic company than traditional compulsory licenses. The European Union and US pretended that the only way to do this was through national legislation, to have a national legislative regime, and then you would have to rely solely on that legislative regime to issue compulsory licenses under very highly constrained circumstances. And the clarification says, no, you can go beyond that. You can have executive orders or emergency decrees or government use authorizations or administrative or judicial orders. All of those are previously permissible, already permissible, and have previously been used by countries that have issued compulsory licenses globally, and are also instantiated in the law of high-income countries, including the US, including Germany, including the United Kingdom. All of them have measures that in essence allow these kinds of decisions. And so it doesn't really give much, though it suggests that it does. The following paragraphs 3 clarifications are when things really start to hurt. One of them says, well, we're going to be generous. We're going to let you issue a compulsory license on a vaccine for all the patents on the components and the final vaccine product itself with a single authorization. Well, that sounds good, except the countries already had that right. In fact, countries have a broader right under existing TRIPS regime to issue compulsory licenses on multiple products. And there are many historical precedents of countries, especially for antiretrovirals to treat HIV/AIDS, that have issued multi-product compulsory licenses. Okay, so again, this suggests that that the text is giving us something, but it's giving us less than we already have. And it could be interpreted to imply that only product by product compulsory licenses are permissible. But even worse, and what is truly a TRIPS plus provision, is for the first time in the WTO, or frankly, virtually any country that we have been able to discover, there's going to be a requirement that the countries list each and every patent on each and every vaccine and on the vaccine and all of its components in its application for a compulsory license to allow generic production. What this means is that patent examiners are going to have to be hired, and they're going to have to be at the National Patent Office, and they're going to have to be WIPO, and they're going to have to be scouring repeated filings to find out if and when and where patents have been filed. But the problem is actually even a little more complicated than that, because when a patent is filed, it can be filed through the WIPO mechanism. There's a period when it's filed that it's unpublished, so no one knows it. Even if alternative procedures are for national filing only, typically those patents are not even published for 18 months. So there are a lot of ghost patent applications we don't even know exist. And even after publication, there's a period of what's called patent pendency, where the patent's not granted, it's undergoing administrative review, and in some countries, opposition procedures, but it's still not a granted patent. And as well, particularly on these emerging and continually improved technologies, there will be new patents filed. There are over 5,000 patents filed in the last year and a half on COVID vaccines and therapeutics already, and there are more that are going to be filed. And so what this means is the countries are going to have to continue to update their authorizations for each and every newly granted patent. And they're just going to have to do this over and over again, because if they haven't listed every patent through, at least through updating, they are subject, the manufacturer and the country are subject to sanctions and penalties for patent infringement. So this is a really, really bad provision. Another provision allows countries to not have to engage in voluntary negotiations. That's already permitted flexibility in the case of emergencies and government use, or what's called public non-commercial use. The only true waiver in the entire agreement is a waiver of Article 31F of the TRIPS agreement, which is a provision which requires that products produced pursuant to compulsory license must be predominantly for the domestic market. And this is the provision that has meant that major producers like India, if they had a patent, would not be able to supply the rest of the world. You know, could no longer be the pharmacy of the developing world if it had to export more than 50% to meet the demand of those countries. And so, you know, the one truly only positive outcome is the waiver of that particular provision. But then it comes with those restrictions about the kind of authorization product by product and with all the patent search and notification requirements. But in addition, countries have a few other obligations that are TRIPS plus that are imposed, primarily drawing on some of the text from the WTO TRIPS agreement Article 31 bis, and really insisted upon by the US, but more so, even more so by Europe. So one of them is that they have to try to prevent diversion, re-exportation to another country. Again, this is TRIPS plus. Countries are free to have international exhaustion and to allow parallel importation, exportation. There's no precedent for an anti-diversion measure for an ordinary compulsory license. This is entirely TRIPS plus. There is a requirement as well that they provide notifications of a complex set of information to the WTO. The information includes the name and address of the authorizing entity, the products for which the authorization has been granted and the duration of the authorization. So that's the vaccine itself and all the components, the quantities for which the authorization has been granted, and the countries to which the products are to be supplied. And this should be notified as soon as possible. So it doesn't need to be notified in advance, but it needs to be notified very quickly. And this is just, there's going to be just a blizzard of filings to the WTO and a blizzard of compulsory patents that need to be searched, and a blizzard of potentially of applications for compulsory licenses, because you might need compulsory licenses not just on the vaccine itself and allowance of export and so forth, but also for the components, many of which are themselves patented. So those are all bad additional requirements of this agreement in the text, basically making countries pay for clarifications that already exist, and for one minor, minor but important waiver of restrictions on the quantity that can be exported. The only reference to data rights is with respect to TRIPS Article 39.3, and it basically says that the requirements of Article 39.3 will not stand in the way of effectuating the permission granted under the compulsory license, which basically will allow generic companies to reference or rely on the originator's clinical trial information to seek regulatory approval. Again, the TRIPS agreement already allows that. The TRIPS agreement does not require data exclusivity or market exclusivity. Only a few rich countries require, well, a lot of rich countries require that, and they've tried to impose it through free trade agreements in other countries, but almost all commentators agree that TRIPS does not require data exclusivity. So again, it's an explanation of something which is already exquisitely clear, and it's actually limited in some important ways that are counterproductive. The measure is going to be a potentially short duration, 3 to 5 years. It has to be reviewed after that and extended by vote of the WTO, which might be hard if rich countries persist in thinking everything's going fine for them. And that is the sum and substance of what the agreement does. It has lots of ambiguities. It has lots of confusing provisions. It has some clarifications that aren't clarifications and that also come back and bite you. There are TRIPS flexibilities, and it doesn't deliver vaccines. It doesn't deliver tests or treatment, and it excludes many of the world's countries from any benefit of this kind of agreement. So Hillary, I'll stop there if that makes sense, and see if we have questions and comments from your participants, because they may have some.
Awesome. Thanks, Brooke. So one question that has come up in this work is we're seeing, all of these like statements come out about the waiver, and the Chamber of Commerce and the pharmaceutical companies put out statements saying that this is just horrendous, that the WTO would waive, these IP rights and that kind of thing. I just wonder, what's your take on that? Are they blowing smoke? Like, what's going on with those statements?
They must be saying that and, smoking their cigars and laughing in the back rooms, right? This doesn't threaten any of their markets in rich countries and some upper middle income countries. Pfizer will not earn 1 cent less than the 37 billion on vaccines it expects this year, and the 22 billion it expects on Paxlovid therapeutic. What they don't like is the precedent. They don't like anyone saying there's a problem with existing flexibilities, because what they've done with existing flexibilities is try to make them as hard to use as possible. Then they've ordered the US and Europe trade negotiators to always complain when a country ever uses them, right? So we've always had countries listed on the special 301 watch list whenever they've tried to use flexibilities. But the companies hate the idea that a compulsory license would be issued. They hate to be ordered to do anything, and they hate the idea that the protections they have will be attacked in any way, because to them it seems like opening a door, right? If we admit that there's a problem with this predominantly for domestic use, well, why don't we think about some other problems with the system? Why don't we think about other defects in the system? And they don't want that. So they want to continue to pretend simultaneously two inconsistent things. On vaccines, they say, we've got plenty. In fact, we may have too much. It's those stupid people in poor countries who don't want to take vaccines. That's now the problem. That's what pharma is saying, in essence. And they also simultaneously want to say, IP is not the problem, but don't touch one iota of it because it's critical. How they can say that in the same paragraph, I don't know, but they do it over and over again.
Great. So another question, do you know if there are countries that are planning to oppose it at the WTO? Do you have any intel on where countries landed?
It's complicated. The two leading countries through this whole process, who have literally spent hundreds of person hours, maybe thousands of person hours negotiating this and analyzing it, are India and South Africa. South Africa's probably been a little more engaged in India. And one way to analyze this is they just got worn down by the European Union opposition and by the US stubbornness about vaccine, and have come up with this bad lowest common denominator solution. What we're hoping is that the decision makers in both India and South Africa will take a pause at the highest level of government and really not be subject to the kind of ennui that the negotiators who are in Geneva may now feel, right? Which is, oh, we've done all this work. This is the best we can do. Sorry, but this is it. That the higher ups might actually say, this just isn't good enough. And to say it's not good enough on the fundamentals and it's not good enough in these TRIPS plus provisions. So the best hope would be if either either India or South Africa stood up. I can see President Ramaphosa doing this because he promised to attack vaccine apartheid and that there would be more vaccines, and this doesn't deliver that. So I could imagine that there could be a process in South Africa where South Africa would come back and say, I know we talked about, our negotiators brought this to it, but it's not good enough. Our president can't accept this, and civil society and experts can't accept this, and we need to do better. And the same thing could happen in India, though the prospects in India, even with an active civil society, it's a different dynamic. It may be a little harder. Simultaneously, activists in other countries are trying to get other countries that have been supporters to suddenly say, well, you promised something significant, and this is not. This is an agreement that it almost is, or definitely is, worse than nothing. But to get one of those countries to stand up, and in a sense, if the South Africa and India haven't indicated their non-support for the agreement, it's hard for a country that's been a little bit on the sidelines to both have the expertise and the gravitas to make those arguments. But we're hoping that that could happen. But simultaneously, and this is more a question about what we in the US do and what activists in Europe do, is can we try to embarrass the policymakers who've insisted on these bad outcomes? The US, which pretends it's sitting on the fence when it's actually aiding and abetting the European Union, and the European Union for insisting that the compulsory license is a solution to a problem where technology transfer is actually essential and has not been accomplished. So that's a pretty long-winded answer. I don't know if that actually answers the question or not.
That's okay. No, I think it was super helpful. So I think this is the last question we're going to get to before we jump to some action steps. But one of my former Washington State colleagues is asking, what should we demand as movements in this moment? And what kind of counter mobilization do you think would be helpful as the WTO takes, however long the WTO takes, to consider the proposal?
Well, I think whatever we could do to get members of Congress to say, this isn't the waiver we heard about. This doesn't get vaccines. This doesn't take care of the therapies that we're now getting for our constituencies. What's going on here? President Biden, why aren't you doing better? So one would try to get some congressional champions through lobbying and otherwise to actually speak up and step forward. Another is to put much more direct pressure on President Biden and his negotiators, which is the U.S. Trade Representative, but also some of the other political offices that are having negative input on this decision. And it's really, I think there the message is twofold. One, this is not the waiver you discussed that you supported back in May. Even if you were on vaccines, you were on vaccines for all IP, and you actually thought there needed to be technology transfer. And you've been frustrated because Moderna won't transfer its technology, even though you've tried to cajole it to do so for the last 12 months. This isn't, you have broken your promise that you made back in May. Let alone you've continued to be myopic about the need for tests and treatment. So pressure on Congress, pressure on the president. It's a hard time to have mass demonstrations, and all of us are struggling about, well, how do we raise the ante a little bit, in terms of what kind of actions we have. And we had a lot of letters. We've had a lot of congressional visits. We've had a few demonstrations, and everything counts. But your thinking is probably as good as mine about what kind of escalation or clarity is required. But I think it's at this point, it's clarity. It's a disgrace that the U.S. has forced this solution and colluded with the European Union to reach this. And our leaders, political leaders, need to hear that we think it's an outrage. The one other thing that I think everyone's been emphasizing, but this for the profit of one industry that's standing to make tens of billions of dollars in sales and profits. We are hobbling the global economy. We're hobbling our economy. We are subjecting ourselves to continuing waves of variants that arise in untreated and unvaccinated populations. We are shamefully racist, in this policy to leave the global South behind, Black and brown people of the global South, without the same products that we have. That these are kind of messages of political and moral and even self-interest, blame and shame that should be brought to the attention. I think we have to be more critical, more publicly critical, and a little less concerned. Well, is Biden going to have another slap on the wrist, and so the Republicans might do better in November? I mean, if he did better on this, people would be reassured of his leadership, I think. And so that's what we ought to be asking for.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brooke. So in the vein of action steps, I want to introduce Ime Xiao, who is an organizer with our Trade Justice Ed Fund team, to talk about some action steps that are on the table right now that folks can do to take action on the proposal. Go ahead, Ime.
Thanks, Hillary, and thank you, Brooke, and thank you everyone for joining us here tonight. Thank you so much for continuing to show up for our community and for everything that I know that everyone's been doing to keep each other safe, even while our government is not even doing the bare minimum, right? So hopefully now after Brooke's presentation, we are all better informed about the current state of affairs with the TRIPS waiver. And like Brooke just said, what we have to do now is make some noise and make sure that, they know that they cannot keep getting away with this, right? Like, we're informed, we know what's going on. They can't just keep lying and pretending that they're doing something that they're not, right? They want us to believe that this is the best they can do and that this is radical and progressive. I read that political article, ridiculous, right? They're excluding so many countries, excluding vital tests, excluding therapeutics, and saying that this is like a radical progressive breakthrough thing that they're doing. And so we want as many folks as possible to be informed about this, right? Because this is our lives, and we truly believe that no one is safe until everyone is. This is just a fact. And so we need to set the groundwork to mobilize our movement. So let's all collectively share the truth about what's going on and tell the administration that, we're still here, we still care, and we won't settle for anything less. Noelle is gonna put in the chat right now some informational links that you can put out on social media so that everyone can be aware of what's going on here. So I think Noelle's gonna, thank you, Noelle. So whether you're on Instagram or on Facebook or on Twitter, these lay out the bare bones of what's going on here. And we need everyone to know about this. All of the suffering that has happened in the past 2 years is not inevitable, as much as folks want to pretend that this is just inevitable and people will die and that's okay. This is the result of bad policy that prioritizes protecting pharma profits over our lives. And it doesn't have to be that way. There has not been a formal agreement yet, and we can push for a better one, right? So I think that the fight is not over until everyone around the world is able to get access to the essential COVID medical technologies that they deserve, that we all deserve. And you can keep up with us through those social media links. We will be mobilizing as we have been for the past, us and all of our partners for the past 2 years have been mobilizing around this. Yeah, so I'll kind of leave it there. Hillary, if I've missed anything.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Ime, for sharing those action steps with us. I do want to flag that this is kind of a situation that's unfolding, and there are going to be new updates that continue to come out as this process unfolds. Please keep in touch through social media online, and we will also be sending out updates as things continue to move and continue to happen. I suspect that we're going to be continuing to work on this up until the ministerial, and that it will take some time for the WTO to push this through, if this is the proposal that they choose to move through, and it's on us to make that harder for them going forward. So thank you all for being here tonight, and for attending, and looking forward to seeing tweets and social media and continuing to work with you all on getting a better proposal. Thanks so much. Have a good night, everyone.